I will begin then. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Does this sound okay, Lisa?
Yep, you sound great, BJ.
Okay. Welcome to today's webinar, Institutional Controls, a Case Study. We will be examining institutional controls for fishing for the Lower Duwamish Waterway Superfund Site in Seattle, Washington as our case study today. This webinar is hosted by the Northwest Toxic Communities Coalition with the support of the University of Washington Superfund Research Program. I am BJ Cummings, Manager of Community Engagement for the Superfund Research Program, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Lisa Hayward, our Research Translation Manager, who will be moderating the question and answer session following our speaker presentations today. Our speakers today are Cliff Villa, professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law. Mr. Villa teaches and writes in the fields of constitutional rights, environmental law, and environmental justice. He served for 22 years as legal counsel for the US EPA in Washington, DC, Denver, and Seattle. As an EPA attorney, Mr. Villa's practice focused on cleanup of contaminated sites and enforcement of federal environmental laws, including the development of the Record of Decision for the Duwamish Superfund Site. Most recently, Mr. Villa co-authored the textbook Environmental Justice, Law, Policy, and Regulation, which came out this year. Also joining us is Piper Peterson, Remedial Project Manager for EPA Region 10. Ms. Peterson has been a Superfund project manager at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Seattle since 1990, and currently serves as the Remedial Project Manager for the Lower Duwamish Waterways Institutional Controls, Implementation, and Assurance Plan. In addition to managing cleanup projects at upland and sediment sites, many of her projects have included a community involvement aspect. She believes the success of Superfund cleanups are rooted in improving the environment, communities, and allowing for economic and recreational opportunities at these sites. And finally, we will hear from James Rasmussen, Superfund Manager at the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, which is EPA's community advisory group for the Lower Duwamish Waterway Site. Mr. Rasmussen is a founding member of the DRCC and represented the Duwamish tribe on the organization's advisory council for 10 years before becoming their executive director in 2011. He served on the Duwamish Tribal Council for 26 years and was the founding director of the Duwamish Tribe's Longhouse and Cultural Center. Mr. Rasmussen has been an active voice in environmental, habitat, and community issues along the Duwamish River and in the Seattle region for over 30 years, and represents DRCC on EPA's Duwamish Superfund Roundtable, which is informing the next phase of the cleanup plan. We are going to go to the speakers in just a moment. Feel free to type questions for the panelists in the chat box, and we will hear from all three speakers, and then Lisa will moderate your questions for our speakers after their presentations. And we're going to begin with Mr. Cliff Villa.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? And you can see the first slide with my name and our lovely Duwamish River. Somebody may call this the Lower Duwamish Waterway Superfund Site, but it is certainly a resource that I think many of us truly come to appreciate and love. I'm delighted to be here talking with you today. Thank you, BJ. Thank you, Lisa. I want to give a shout out to BJ, your fabulous book. I'm almost through it right now, The River That Made Seattle, really loving it. Things I think I know about the Duwamish, I'm still learning all the time, and I'm thrilled really to be here, and I hope to be able to learn from you. So my job today is really to help establish a foundation for the conversation that particularly presentations that follow later. I'm going to talk about what institutional controls are in general and how they have evolved, how our understanding of institutional controls have evolved over time. And I'm really just setting up the conversations that you and the presentations you'll hear later from Piper and James and other conversations. So here we go. A short history of institutional controls. I gave a version of this at a presentation. Many of the same people might be hearing this, and I'll try to not dwell on it. But our thinking about institutional controls has evolved over time, from something that I'll call magic incantations through getting serious about institutional controls to finally, I think, where we are now, which is rethinking about the place, the value of institutional controls as a remedial response. So magic incantation sort of is my characterization of the initial sort of idea about institutional controls. We thought that we could keep people away from contamination by just using magic words like deed restrictions. If we say that people can't use a certain contaminated property for residential development, we think that that will prevent people from actually using that property for residential development. Well, we know that's not true, and we know what could happen when when these magic words fail us. Here's a example from Southern Oregon near Klamath Falls. This was an old military hospital in World War II. When the war ended, it was quickly demolished and used for other purposes, including residential development. It became known as Northridge Estates, and the developers who built these homes didn't bother to remove any of the demolition debris. It was still scattered everywhere, and it was full of asbestos. This is an asbestos insulation on the steam pipe that ran underneath the entire facility. These are chunks of asbestos wallboard. It was in the roofing. It was in the floor tiles. Asbestos was everywhere. And the thing is that the developers, when they were doing this demolition, were actually caught in the act. EPA in 1979 issued an order to cease and desist this demolition. And what we know is that the developers didn't do it. Sometimes they took the demolition debris and they shoved it into a hole. And sometimes there's just lots of asbestos debris left on the surface, like this pile of really toxic form of asbestos known as amosite. The developers said they were going to put deed restrictions on the property. They said they were not going to allow people to build homes here, and they did exactly the opposite. This was a case where saying there shall be deed restrictions is not the same as actually following up and enforcing them. And all these people lost their homes, had to be relocated permanently, and the town remains much of a ghost town today, although it's finally being cleaned up with your tax dollars and mine under Superfund. So we start to more seriously about institutional controls. How are we going to keep people away from contamination if magic words won't save us? So when Superfund is passed in 1980 and then amended in 1986, we get language like this on how to select a remedy for Superfund contamination. Section 121 of the Superfund statute says, among other things, remedial actions, including treatment, which permanently and significantly reduces the volume, toxicity, mobility, are to be preferred over remedial actions not involving treatment. There is a statutory preference for treating contamination, not simply putting institutional controls on it to try to keep people away from that contamination. And that concept in the statute is reflected in the regulations that implement CERCLA. EPA expects to use institutional controls, such as water use and deed restrictions, to supplement engineering controls to prevent limited exposure. But the use of institutional controls shall not substitute for active response measures as the sole remedy, unless such active measures are deemed to be not practicable. The idea is that there is a preference for treatment. Institutional controls may have a role in protecting people, but they shall not substitute for treatment unless there's some reason why they can't. Well, that's the law. Those are the rules. And here comes the Clinton administration with one of the so-called Superfund administrative reforms that came out of the 1990s. This is a new policy on considering land use in the Superfund remedy selection process. Everybody agrees that considering future land use is a good thing when you're selecting remedies. But really what a big part of this policy is to encourage greater use of institutional controls. For example, if you have an industrial area and it will remain an industrial area, then maybe you don't have to clean it up to some sort of residential standard. If you're going to depend and rely upon a future land use, you've got to have really, truly enforceable institutional controls. And that was a big point of this policy issued by EPA in 1975. Now, 1995. Now, whether or not this is consistent with the statutory preference for treatment or not might remain a question. There are various policies. There are citizens' guides to institutional controls like this one, that if you had no background in institutional controls at all, they could sort of help you understand at least how EPA understands institutional controls. One of the things that you might get from these various guidances are categories of institutional controls to start breaking down what institutional controls really look like. One of those categories is governmental controls. The government, particularly local governments, could pass a zoning ordinance. You may or may not build industrial facilities here. Local governments may require a building permit before you're allowed to construct a new construction. When we're talking about a military base like the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, military commanders can issue orders that govern the use of their property. And that might be a very effective way of preventing unsafe uses of property that remains contaminated. Another category of institutional controls is something we might call a proprietary control. These are restrictions on use of the land by some sort of legal mechanism like an easement or a covenant. And these usually rely on tools of property law, which are often defined by state law, not the feds. And so you really need to know and understand state law, local law, in order to make these kind of controls effective. And we'll talk more about that with some examples later. Another category of institutional control may be known as enforcement tools. If a party is being sued and as part of the settlement, they agree to do certain things or not allow certain things with their property, that can be another enforceable means of an institutional control. It could be a settlement in the form of a consent decree. It could be a permit that is issued under some environmental authority, and then the permit could be enforced to enforce restrictions on use of properties. And a final category of institutional controls is what are known as informational devices. Things like deed notices, things like a sign along the river, and we're going to see examples of that. Educational items. I know I'm going fast, by the way, and I'm happy to make these slides available if anyone is scrambling to take notes. Also, if there's any questions in chat, please do let me know that as well. So here's an example of the category of institutional controls known as proprietary controls, restrictions on the use of a certain property, which depends largely on state law, including the law of the state of Washington, which has passed a law known as the Uniform Environmental Covenants Act. Many states have also adopted what's UECA, the Uniform Environmental Covenants Act. The state of Idaho has also passed a UECA, for example. And what this does is it allows properties to be restricted in their use as a matter of state law. And those restrictions can run with the land, they can transfer from one property owner to another, and they can be enforced by various parties, including EPA and the State Department of Ecology. Many states have a version of UECA. This is the state of Washington's UECA. You could find it RCW 64.70.050 to read about how these covenants may be enforced. Many states also have a form of land use restrictions. This is the California Civil Code. It doesn't say environmental covenants, but it's about the same thing. My state of New Mexico here has something that is sort of like this as well. Sometimes you need an attorney to go and help you explain. Informational devices you've probably seen, including this one along the Duwamish River that tells you to eat salmon, but don't eat too much of it. and don't eat other certain kinds of fish. So that might be something that helps people keep away from contamination. Here's another informational device from the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. If you find a bomb on the beach, don't touch it. And here's a coloring book to encourage kids not to play with bombs they find on the beach. Well, not all kids are going to do what they're told. Not all dogs are going to do what they're told, and not all people are going to do what they're told. And maybe they shouldn't be not fishing anyway. And so we start to enter the third phase of institutional controls, which is sort of rethinking the concept of institutional controls. We had some help in this rethinking. The National Environmental Justice Advisory Council issued a report in 2002 talking about fish consumption and how important that is for certain segments of the community. We can't simply tell, for example, Native communities to not eat fish. That would be in violation of their treaty fishing rights. There have been a number of scholars very active in this area, including Catherine O'Neill, my former colleague at CLU, who've written very effectively. You can't make kids not make mud pies, including on this very beach of the Coeur d'Alene River. There are lots of signs in different languages: no make mud pies, don't fish, don't eat the fish, and yet people will and have a right to do that. So that brings us back to the lower Duwamish Waterway, also the Duwamish River. There is a record of decision for this. It was signed in 2014. I probably wrote some of the words in it. I might have written some of these words that talk about the remedy in terms of doing some actual treatment, doing some dredging of contaminated sediments, but also including institutional controls. Now, what those institutional controls look like is very much a part of the discussion for today and a lot of development over the last 5 years. But it will include things like proprietary controls, deed restrictions, covenants. It will include things like informational devices, like those signs you saw along the river. It will include things like fish consumption advisories. At least it will include those things until those things become no longer necessary. So BJ, I hope I'm still in my 10 minutes, and I'm hoping to be able to stick around and answer some questions. And I look forward to the presentations to follow. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cliff. We're gonna go to Piper Peterson, Remedial Project Manager at EPA, to talk about the specifics of the institutional control plan for the Duwamish site. And Piper, I'll remind you that you'll hear that little beeping noise at the 10-minute mark.
Great, I've got a timer here too. Hello everybody, thanks for the invitation today from the Northwest Toxics Communities Coalition and the University of Washington Superfund Research Program. I stand on the shoulders of giants. I have started working on this project in January this year. So definitely want to start out by shouting out to Becky Chu and Julie Congdon, who have worked on this project the last 5 or 6 years. And I will try to identify all the correct partners at the correct time as I go through my presentation today. The Institutional Control Implementation and Assurance Plan, ICIAP, we call it the IC plan for clarity. And this is the title of it. This was selected by the communities through a community-based process, iterative, fun to catch, toxic to eat. And you can see below the byline is the same words in 4 languages: English, Khmer, Spanish, and Vietnamese. Next slide. Piggybacking off of where Cliff so aptly set me up, thank you, Cliff, without coordinating. There are live links in this presentation, and I have provided this to BJ and her crew to share with everybody afterwards. The Lower Duwamish Record of Decision, Lower Duwamish Waterway, I should say, Record of Decision, 2014, and Cliff shared with you the language in that about the institutional controls. And you also saw that the Fisher study was underway. The Fisher study was conducted by the Lower Duwamish Waterway Group, Ludwig, and sometimes I'm going to point out that, for example, this was amended to their administrative order on consent. So there definitely is legal components in this program that's very heavily community-based. So that's something to consider as you're thinking about implementing these kinds of programs, perhaps in your projects. Ludwig contracted Just Health Action to work on this and partner with them. who also partnered with the Environmental Coalition of South Seattle, ECOS, and they created community health advisors. They worked with Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, technical assistant grants, TAG, the BRCC is called in this role, Public Health, Seattle King County, and Washington Department of Health. So when I say stand on the shoulders of giants, I really mean that. There's a lot of people that are involved in many, many aspects of this project. It is iterative, and it's adaptable, and it's constantly reevaluating, finding out what's working, and improving areas or moving deeper into subject matter once initial things are met and initial programs are set up. We'll keep talking about that throughout my presentation. Conducting some of this work is most of this work right now is Public Health Seattle King County. We've had a cooperative agreement with them for the last 4 years and planning on that through 2021 and probably beyond. The Lower Duwamish Waterway Group funds this cooperative agreement. And then through the work of the Fisher study, in conjunction with all of these fine partners, the Institutional Control Implementation and Assurance Plan was finalized last fall. Next slide. In that institutional control plan, there are some requirements for the Lower Duwamish Waterway Group to perform. It's on page 14. There are 8 bullets. I'm trying to be more visual rather than drown you in words. So we conducted the Fisher study first. We had to find out a couple of questions. There's 2 parts. Part 1 was, how is the Duwamish currently being used for the collection and consumption of seafood, particularly the resident seafood? That's the seafood that's most highly contaminated in the Duwamish. Part 2 of the Fisher study had 2 questions. What are the perceived benefits of consuming seafood from the Duwamish? And what is currently known by the community about the risk of consuming seafood from the Duwamish? So the Fisher study was a lengthy study, several years. We knew that pollution has disproportionate impacts on communities of color and low-income families. One of the outcomes of the study. You can see here who's eating and who's sharing the catch from the Duwamish. We found that there were over 25 ethnic language groups, 25% or so were Asian and Pacific Islander. Residents were in the South Seattle and West Seattle area, south of the Seattle city limits, and some fishers even came over 33 miles to fish in the Duwamish.
Piper, your voice keeps dropping and I lose some of what you're saying.
Is that true for all? I'm not sure.
I'm not having any issue.
Okay. Next slide. Sorry about that, Darlene. This will be recorded, and hopefully the recording is not dropping words. So there was quite a complex process in how to identify, how to reach people that were on the river and along the river fishing, how to talk to people in their native language, how to select people to interact with the fishers so that they would talk with them, might not be willing to talk to me coming from EPA or another government person or a fish and wildlife person down along the river. So it was quite a complex process, and I do hope that you use the link that I provided in an earlier slide so that you can dig deeper into the process. But what we figured out is with the communities that are fishing there, it's very much a fishing culture. Why are they down there? Why are they fishing? And I say down there, sorry, my office is in Seattle, so it's south of where our building is. But there's 4 major categories. It fulfills social identity, sharing, food, and learning how to fish. It's fun to do. It's what people do to recreate. It's what people do to feed themselves. It's what people do to have gesture of gifting and providing for their culture, their community, their family. And it's important that we acknowledge that, because to say, as Cliff said, don't make mud pies, don't play in the river, isn't sufficient. there's a basis that people are there. There's a reason for people being there. It's important to know that. Next slide. So out of the Fisher study, taking up into consideration all the information that we found, the IC plan was developed. Here's a great example of what the communities have had to do in the time of COVID. The moms and children's groups that are working on a plan, which I'll talk about later, have all very adeptly and adroitly moved to Zoom. Some of the best meetings I've actually been in have been with the local communities, working with their leadership or working with their individual communities. And it's been quite amazing to see. What we found in the IC plan, or what the IC plan is for, is strategies and tools for promoting healthy seafood consumption within the lower Duwamish Waterway fishing communities. As Cliff stated with the fish advisory that he showed earlier, there are certain salmon you can eat up to 12 meals of, other salmon up to 4 meals, and right now, please stay away from the resident fish, flatfish, and shellfish. The goal, the target audience for this plan are the fishers, pregnant moms and nursing moms, and children 0 to 6. Those are the highest risk populations. Of course, the program looks at everybody that's fishing in the Duwamish, and the messages go for everyone that might be down there. Next slide, please. So what does the institutional compliance say? And I've provided page numbers so that you're able, again, use the link on one of my earlier slides and find the specific activities that are identified right now as inside, we say inside the institutional control plan, before, during, and after cleanup. And there's 5 of them. Training community health advocates, which are communities working in, which are leaders working in their specific community, which we're currently working with the Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Spanish communities. There are 2 curricula that have been developed, version 1, and then based on how that worked and how it was rolled out and learnings from the leadership and the communities receiving the training, they've updated it to version 2 just recently. There's a Duwamish Fishing Club strategy that's still in development, working with the people that fish to educate them, create community, teach them how to legally fish for salmon, the gear that's included, all those kinds of things. There's moms classes and salmon cooking demonstration. There's a 3-part mini series, and they're just getting ready to roll that out when COVID struck. Let me look for the three courses are developing knowledge about salmon in the Duwamish, how to decline a resident fish from the Duwamish. Oftentimes the men are fishing and they bring it home to the women in the office or in the home to prepare, and then how to skin and prepare salmon. And the last 2 items are strategies by influencers and messengers and a communication strategy. Next slide. Things that are connected to the IC program that may not have, but that may not fall within the circle regulation. Here's some items, and these are located on these pages in the IC plan. Fishing rules with Department of Fish and Wildlife, transport provided to alternative fishing sites in King County and Puget Sound, and elements around eating fish, labeling, healthy choices, supermarket discounts. Next slide. What's completed so far is this pocket guide. These are live links when you get the presentation. Go look it up in a native language. That's how non-English speakers see our fish advisory when they're only written in English. So the program has a real emphasis on making sure that we're communicating in their native languages with the images they're used to seeing in the culturally appropriate ways. Next slide. They've completed a coloring and activity book with Sammy the fisherman. Next slide. Recently rolled out today, if BJ gives me the thumbs up, fishing videos are live on the Washington Department Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel, and you are the first to see the live links. So go and watch these. There's 9 videos about how to fish for salmon and how to prepare salmon. And next slide. There's a myriad of other institutional tools that are institutional control tools that are completed. Here is the Public Health Seattle-King County webpage with the items listed to your right. Next slide. Thank you. This is thank you in all 4 languages that we're working in. And next slide. My contact information if you have questions after today.
Great.
Thanks, BJ, for giving me an extra minute.
Thank you, Piper. So I just want to make a quick announcement before moving to James. Lisa has been attempting to locate the chat function, which for some reason Zoom does not seem to want to give us at the moment. So just keep a note of your questions, and we are coming up with a different strategy to collect those from you at the end. And we're going to go on to James Rasmussen now, the Superfund Manager for Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition.
Hello. I have to make sure I'm on here. Yes. I'm unmuted. Can you hear me okay? Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the other presenters today for all of the work that they've done. And the work that they've done has not been easy in that sense. One of the things that I want to be able to start with is 3 definitions. Number 1 is the definition of environmental justice. And instead of going to EPA's website, I just went to Wikipedia because it gives a much more rational version. Environmental justice is the fair treatment, meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So, the way we describe this is actually to the community environmental injustice, because that's what they experience. Understand that the Duwamish Valley, which we're involved with, the communities of Georgetown and South Park, both are incredibly inundated with contaminants from the trucks and cars that are driving through their community to all of the contamination sites that are in the industrial areas that they live around. The first important point that needs to be made is that these communities are both older than the city of Seattle, and that when the city decided that it was going to create an industrial area here, what they did was anything that was not residential property or had a house on it became industrial property, which is much different than other fence line communities that we see across the country. And I think that's an important difference that needs to be made and talked about. The next thing I would like to go to is the idea, and I'm not casting aspersions here, but it's important for everybody to understand. What is institutional racism? And the definition, again, from Wikipedia, is a form of racism which is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination and criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other issues. The reason I bring that up is because this is not the obvious, this is the slow effects that happen to communities. And my final point is institutional controls, which are non-engineered instruments, such as administrative legal controls that help minimize the potential for human health exposures to contamination and or protect the integrity of the remedy. With that, several thoughts come to my mind. Obviously, ideal from a community point of view. We are the community advisory group to EPA. We are the technical advisory group to the communities. This is very important to us. We do our work differently than most people do. And we work closely with the community to make sure it's not our ideas, but their ideas that are coming forward. So as we talk about the issues of institutional controls on the Duwamish River, obviously it is an important issue, but also understand that most of the groups that make up the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, years before it was even brought into existence, were ones that were pushing for the signs that are on the Duwamish River today. And you can still see some of those old signs in a bunch of different languages, and do not fish for local fish here. We understood that. One of the first symbols from DRCC was actually a fisherman, because we understood that that was the most important aspect of the cleanup of the river where it affects community health. So when we go beyond that, we talk about the survival of salmon, which right now in Puget Sound, they are threatened. And the other point of this, which I cannot make hardly enough, is that the most affected people in Puget Sound are tribes. Tribes that this is the food they eat. And from elders in tribal groups in Puget Sound is the statement that they would rather eat, even though they know it's contaminated. But this is part of their life. This is part of their family. And to kind of close so that we can get ahead of the curve, there are two questions, because questions are coming up next, and that gives me the opportunity to do that. Is number one, to Mr. Villa, the first response of the record of decision, can we as the government make responsible parties actually do things as far as the institutional control program. And your first response was, yes, but I believe we can. Later on, it was no, which created an issue of things that are inside the box and outside the box. The second question, and this is not fair to Piper because she hasn't been there long enough, is why were not tribes involved in the IC program? And I can forward several reasons. They have a separate relationship with EPA, and which is government to government. And if they didn't believe they wanted to be, that's fine. But I was just wondering if there was any idea of the outreach that might have been done to the tribes that harvest salmon on the Duwamish River. With that, I want to finish with saying, yeah, I hear it. I hear it, BJ. I'm closing. Is the work that has been done by EPA on this site is groundbreaking. And I am very proud to be part of the work that has been done. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that, yes, we pushed early in this process to make sure these things happened. So if your question is, how do you make it happen? Well, you have to push early on. But the other part is that I look forward very much now, because we've had a relationship with Piper in the past, and we look forward because Piper has actually told us is that she's looking at moving forward and having, you know, new things be able to happen, and I'm very buoyant because of that, and I am happy to close. Nobody has said anything about recent deaths and those type of things within our society and the upheaval in our society. All of these things are related. And I think it's important to recognize, number one, Black lives matter in this country. And number two, that anytime we have an opportunity to address institutional racism, we need to be able to do that. And so with that, I'm done.
Thank you very much, James. So we have two questions on the table from James, and we can go to Lisa Hayward to moderate questions from the audience as well. Hopefully we have a system for figuring that out now without the chat box. I'm going to turn this over to Lisa to start, I believe, with James's questions and then take questions from.
Can I jump in real quick, BJ? I forgot to mention something, and it just came in on Monday. James, to your point about this being a groundbreaking program, the NACHO, they're called, it's the National Association of County and City Health Officials, has designated this project as a model practice. The Public Health Seattle-King County put in for the designation. It's entitled Building an Innovative Community Participatory Practice to Advance Environmental Justice at the Duwamish River Superfund Site. And by its designation as a model practice, that means that it demonstrates exemplary and replicable qualities in response to local public health need. The program reflects a strong local health department role, collaboration, innovation, and has demonstrated its value through evaluation. So
we'll send that link out along with the rest.
thanks.
Lisa, do you have James's two questions ready to take questions from the rest?
Yeah, I have to apologize that our chat feature is not enabled. I think that's part of the University of Washington security. We didn't catch that. So you should all have the ability to unmute yourselves if you want to just do that and then ask your question verbally. Or you can look at the More feature. You can raise your hand. It's down at the bottom of the if you're showing participants list. There's a little circle that says More. You can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and call on you that way. Hopefully we can get all the questions addressed through those systems.
I heard a question from James directed to me. So is that somewhere we should start then?
Yeah, I think that would be a great start.
Okay. So I think the question to restate it, and James, you could help clarify it more if you like, is how far can EP or any agency go in terms of providing access to a resource like fish to be caught? If the fish in the river are not safe to eat, could EPA simply distribute fresh fish, for example, or fishing gear, or transportation, as we're seeing now? There's a lot of things that agencies can do, and there's probably more things that private actors can do. So the PRPs here, Ludwig, Boeing, for example, could do whatever Boeing wants to do. And if they find in their own interest to provide fresh fish or fishing gear or transportation, they can do a lot of things. Part of the challenge, though, is if they don't want to do that, what is the authority of any agency to sort of compel them to do that? And so, you know, as an EPA attorney, I could make legal arguments, and I'm happy to have had that experience. And I'm also happy to be outside the agency now, because I can offer even freer thoughts. One of the experiences, though, that I had as an EPA attorney in actually distributing fresh fish came from my experience in Region 8 in Denver, Colorado. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages a national wildlife refuge known today as the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge. And the problem there was prairie dogs who were contaminated. They were burrowing into contaminated soil, and they would come out of the burrows, and they would get captured and eaten by bald eagles, and the eagles were getting poisoned by DDT, among other things, from these poisoned prairie dogs. The Fish and Wildlife Service had this great idea that they were going to discourage the eagles from eating prairie dogs by feeding the eagles slabs of salmon. And so they put these slabs of salmon out on a pad, and the eagles would have a great time. Well, the challenge with that was, as soon as the first or second bald eagle figures out this free food, they invite their friends. And then you begin to have sort of a crowd of bald eagles who become dependent on these free salmon. And you know, it's one of lessons that we learn again and again, that as soon as you tinker with any part of the ecosystem, you find it's connected to everything else. Administration is the real challenge here. It's not, in my view, necessarily a question of law of whether or not one agency can force someone else to pay for fish. It's if you did that, if agencies, if the tribe, if other people agreed that was a good thing to do, how do you do it? How do you do it in a way that will respect treaty rights, for example, that will respect cultural interests, for example, and not just become something that ends up with consequences you don't anticipate, like all the bald eagles expecting now free salmon in the suburbs of Denver. So I always believe that creative lawyers, inside or outside of any organization, can find solutions. And there have been some wonderful creative solutions that have been come up with here, and I'm learning more about them all the time. And I think it's really just what does a community want? And James mentioned that again and again. What do people want, and how can agencies and private parties like Ludwig work together to figure that out? And if they're not able to figure it out, well, I don't know that any amount of litigation is going to get there either. Ultimately, it has to be something that people agree on. So I'm not sure that's ever going to answer your question, James, but there have been efforts to provide free fish. It's always a question of, is that really what the community wants in the end? I think what this community wants is to be able to fish from the Duwamish River, not to be given, continual alternatives to fishing from the river. So that's all I have for that question.
Thank you, Cliff. I think one other thing that you did not mention is that what is included in judgments in court as far as environmental justice and the issues in like ICs and that type of thing, judgments that have been made that would actually force a responsible party to do something, and they're not there.
So
That's another.
we've got a lineup of questions, so I just want to respect the audience questions as well. So let's come back to that one and to James's question to Piper after we take a couple audience questions.
Okay, I see Cassie Cohen with a hand raised, and I'm sorry if I said your name wrong.
Okay. Hi there. Yeah, I'm sort of trying to take care of some kids right now. But anyway, I'm in Portland. I'm the director of the Portland Harbor Community Coalition. I'm working to engage the community on the Portland Harbor Superfund Site. And I have sort of a, I don't know, it's a question that probably can't be answered easily, but for anyone who wants to take a stab at it. But like, how do you even think about engaging the community in an institutional control design process when there's bound to be sort of long-term institutional controls required, indefinitely, because cleanup levels will not be high enough, or well, maybe I'm not understanding it right, but I mean, it's part of the cleanup, is to have those permanent institutional controls. And how do you basically think about approaching community folks when they already are devastated, when they hear statements from like EPA folks or the City of Portland folks who sort of will say, without really thinking sensitively about the impacts of how, oh, you'll never get to fish again, or it's never going to get cleaned up to the point of it being able to be safe to catch resident fish. When there's folks that we're working with who have fished for generations here, they grew up fishing, they didn't know it was contaminated, they were consuming fish all the time, and they want their grandchildren, so like, how do you even think about a public engagement process around designing these institutional controls when really the issue is people just want to get that river fully cleaned up so they can actually consume those fish safely? That institutional controls are not doing that, I'll close with that. Thanks.
James, I see you with your hand up.
The response I have is that our goal is not to make sure that it is completely safe for people, but can we come to some kind of equilibrium with people who fish in Puget Sound, which still has health regulations on it, and the Duwamish? This, I believe, is a goal that we're looking at. Now, there will be health regulations, yes, but will they be much lower than they were before? Hopefully so. That's the goal of the cleanup program. And so, number one, it's important to be realistic, but it's also important to have a goal. And that's kind of where we are right now.
If I could add to that, and I really appreciate the comment, Cassie, and I think that your comments and comments like that are so essential to keep the pressure on the agencies, to keep pressure on everyone to keep doing more than they think they could do, because you never know. I want to see if I could do something. I want to beg a moment from BJ and share one slide. Can people see this one slide on the screen now? This is what, not that. I'm sorry. I want to show you something from Colorado. This is what is known as an infinity room. This is plutonium. This is the plutonium stockpile that was made for nuclear weapons. And it was so contaminated that people assumed that that room could never be opened because it would never be safe to open a door and manage that plutonium. It's gone now. It's gone because people weren't afraid to think, how can we deal with something that is even plutonium? And eventually they develop robotics. They figure out ways to take things apart from the inside out. You never know until you start. You never know what can be achieved in the Duwamish or Portland Harbor or other places. When they tell you it can't be done, you say, okay, that's a first step. Because I have already seen some amazing things done. The infinity rooms at Rocky Flats are gone. And if they could find a place to move plutonium safely, they can find a place to deal with PCBs too. It may take time, but if people aren't pushing and agitating, it won't happen. But if people are pushing and agitating, it could.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, and thanks, James, as well.
Just to add a couple of words onto that, I think that the Lower Duwamish Waterway Record of Decision, it has cleanup levels in it. Sometimes there's a question of, can we ever get to those low cleanup levels? We don't know how to. It's kind of our plutonium room. But the Record of Decision for the Lower Duwamish Waterway, and I'm not sure where you are in the Portland Harbor process, but we do have cleanup numbers. Some of those numbers, because of science, may not be low enough to eat unlimited fish. But if we got to those levels and we're constantly pushing, and sometimes we can find surprises, I'm hoping on another one of my projects, that we may have gotten cleaner than we thought we even could. And I hope to roll that information out when I get that report in a couple of weeks. And I will share that with the PRP and the community forums. It'll be a public document, of course. So I agree with Cliff. Keep pushing. We all have our roles. We all have our jobs, and I think one never knows. I'm pushed as the new person on institutional control plan to do more things. And the way I described it last week is, it's an onion. You have to start by understanding who the community is and what they want. You can't give them, if nobody's saying today, I want seafood vouchers, or I want a delivery of 10 pounds of fish at my doorstep on a monthly or weekly basis, then why would we do that? So right now they're saying, we don't know the project. We need to understand the project in our language. We need some tools. We need to break down this fish advisory and understand what we're dealing with. And I think those are the things that you'll see with the coloring books, working with the moms and pregnant nursing mothers, the young children, having alternative fishing locations. Portland, I was just thinking, where else would you go to fish? We are very lucky in the Puget Sound region. We have Lake Washington, we have Puget Sound, we have Elliott Bay. So there are some, it might be harder to get there and not as convenient as walking from South Park down a few blocks. But we at least have water bodies. We're not sending them to the coast.
Well, it's either the Superfund site or the Hanford, the Columbia River.
Right. So I don't know where we will get to next. As different needs are satisfied, new needs may emerge, new opportunities may emerge. It is a partnership. I think when we start trying to force people to do anything, tell the community we cannot, tell the PRPs you must, we've kind of lost. We need to figure out how is this in everybody's best interest. Everybody needs to be sitting down, communicating, hearing the words, seeing the expressions, and finding opportunities.
Thank you, Piper. We see another hand from Valerie Chu. Valerie, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, can I start the video too?
Sure, please do.
Okay. I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. Could you start my video again? Okay. Hi, my name is Valerie, and this is Queenie. So that's who I was shouting at first, but yes, you know, she's a little tiny little bird who's anyways, I'm a toxicologist, and I just have a technical question. When I did notice the fish consumption levels applied to resident fish versus transient fish like salmon. And I wonder, like, I just have a question about Chinook salmon because they spend 1 to 2 years in the estuary, like Puget Sound. And I just, I'm concerned about the contamination levels in Chinook salmon because of how long they stay in the estuarian environments. So could somebody tell me if there's like a follow-up study or something? Because I know that like it's based on PCB concentrations in the health advisory. And I just wonder how conservative it is for Chinook salmon.
I'll try and take a stab at that one. And James, please jump in, or BJ, if you know more specifically. Chinook salmon are one of the 2 salmon. I don't know the other one. I just saw this on the advisory as Cliff put it up. And maybe Cliff, you can find that advisory slide again to show. So that Chinook salmon is up to 4 meals, whereas some of the other salmon, there's 4 other salmon that are up to 12 meals a month. So I think that's probably what the Department of Health Fish Advisory is acknowledging. I am not steeped in the background of how these numbers came to be, and you know, there's all sorts of education around what an EPA risk assessment is and how the Department of Health determines advisory numbers, and you're probably far more an expert in that than I am. But that, I would take that as the first crack, that there are differences of the numbers of fish that can be consumed. James?
And to answer your questions, these are some of the exact questions that we are working with EPA on at this point. And to make sure that people understand, yes, salmon are the safer choice. But to try to make sure that people understand that it's, you can't just eat as many salmon as you want. You need to be careful about that, whether you're a mother, you know, or many other issues that those warnings need to be out there as well. And it is a very fine line, because we want people to not eat the local seafood, which is incredibly toxic compared to the salmon that are, well, I was going to say slightly more toxic, or slightly toxic. And that is something that is really important. In our case, we want to make sure the community understands the truth. No matter what it is, no matter where it is, on cleanup or whatever it is, they have to understand that there are health warnings in southern Puget Sound on salmon. And the Duwamish fish are part of that southern Puget Sound warming. But yes, it is the healthier choice, and we understand that. But can we move people to other places to be able to fish to be able to do other things. That, I think, is one of the goals that we look forward to.
Hey, Valerie. This is Tom Burbacher. I've been talking with Dave McBride over the last month about how they've developed their fish advisories. And the one thing that's fairly evident is that it's not just based on the PCB levels, it's also based on what they feel what are the benefits of eating fish and weighing the benefits versus the risk. So it's not just a number that comes out from a risk assessment in terms of how much PCBs are in the fish. That's also balanced with, if that number is so low that they feel it would reduce the benefits from fish eating, there's some adjustments that are made there. So as far as the information I have from Dave and other people I've talked to over the years, there is a risk benefit consideration when you come down to the final numbers.
For the benefit of others on the line, Dave McBride is responsible for fish consumption advisories for the Washington State Department of Health.
And I think there was a few years back, somebody looked at salmon all over the place, like up to Alaska, where we think of pristine waters and clean fish, and are finding slight concentrations. And I can't talk to the risk levels of what that was found.
It looks like the numbers that they're using that data are from Puget Sound. There are some numbers from the Duwamish. They're not that much different from the numbers in Puget Sound. They're fairly consistent. Alaska's different. They're much lower.
Washington Coast is not included in the Puget Sound advisory.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
Yes, this is Darlene. I have a question to EPA. For years, I tried to get signage at the hazardous waste site in Port Angeles, the Rayonier Mill. And when states finally, because Norm Dix made a few calls for me back in the early 2000s, the agencies folded and said, okay, what do you want? When the city of Port Angeles heard there were going to be signs up, they struck back the agencies and said that will ruin our businesses. All these years, 30 years later almost, we still don't have signs. And of course, the whole harbor is a MOTCA cleanup site, a priority MOTCA cleanup site, as well as the Rayonier Mill at the eastern end of the harbor. EPA, whether you remember this or not, really oversees ecology on this issue. I don't know if ecology has kept you up to date at all, but could EPA step in and demand that signs be put up along the Olympic Discovery Trail that follows the harbor and the Rayonier site? People walk onto the Rayonier site all the time. People are out there fishing. They take children out there. It's unfortunate. So is there some help that EPA can give me on that?
So this is Piper, the EPA spokesperson today, that really knows nothing about the site. I'm sorry about that. When we use words like, can EPA demand something, as I alluded to earlier, I think those strong words are never a starting point with a conversation. And it sounds like there's a lot of history here with you working with ecology and the MOTCA program. We've tried, I don't know why they have the site and we don't. We make decisions about that. I don't know if it was ever considered for a national priority listing site.
Yes, it was.
Site. and what the decisions were made. You know, what your question appears easy, but it's very layered and complicated. So I could get your information and have somebody contact you directly. I'm just going to be the wrong person to do that. I do know that, you know, there's examples where along the Coeur d'Alene, Trail of Coeur d'Alene's in Idaho, people have put down a trail and that's used as capping material. They very intentionally have put places where people can picnic. The cap has been expanded there, and then there are signs that say, you know, essentially don't get off the trail. You can do things with attractive nuisances like, you know, put prickly roses and kinds of vegetation that is not user-friendly, people-friendly. If you want people to stay on a trail, and in other areas you can have a softscape and features that allow people to exit trails or pathways in the right places. So you know, yes, there's all sorts of things that are possible. I don't know either what the Department of Health role is on coastal you know, areas for harbors like that. So there's just a lot of information. I can't say, oh, sure, we need to do this, or bad idea, and this is why.
I'm just asking for signs. Is there
Right.
somebody at EPA?
Well, you know, honestly, I don't even know. The answer to the question is, James, you would know because you've been on the project longer. Who put the signs up even along the Duwamish in this area? Was that EPA? Their Department of Health signs.
It was a consortium of people that or nonprofit organizations that had worked hard to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Darlene, we have a new director now at ecology. And even though I know that it's hard to start a process over again, you might have a better opportunity now with the Department of Ecology because of what she has said so far.
Mm-hmm. Good idea.
And so and the most important part of that is tell the stories from the community and how it's affected the community. Mm-hmm. So that it actually becomes something real to the new director.
Thanks, that's good.
Thanks, Piper and James. Cliff, did you want to add anything?
Well, I worked on the Trail of the Coeur d'Alene's in Idaho, and the signs were really funded by the Union Pacific Railroad. And they found that it was really in their interest, one, to sort of tell a real story about the history of railroads, which was integrally tied with the history of mining and sort of respects a bit of the mining culture and community there. But two, they really do have an important effect, as Piper mentions, about helping for people to understand how to use the trail safely, where they can stop, where they should not stop and go through safely. And you know, I know the NOTAM trail you're talking about, Darlene, North Olympic. I forget what the acronym was, but it is a beautiful trail. It is something to be celebrated, and Port Angeles is a beautiful location as well. There should be ways to respect the concerns of the community as well as keep people safe. And maybe not only is it an issue to raise to the new director of the Department of Ecology, but also it's always worth, you know, trying the local government as well. Mayors come and go, city councils come and go. If you just find some person who understands what your real concerns are, and I know that you've done this for 30 years, but when new people come, they might be open to new ideas as well. So if you feel you've beat your head against a wall enough times, maybe you're going to find someone at some point who listens. And I really hope they will choose to listen to you this time.
They actually put up excellent signs when they were cleaning up the K-ply. And it was very effective. I'm sure Rainier will have a fit if signs went up. But good suggestions. Thank you both, all three of you, very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Darlene, for the question. I saw that Lance had his hand up a while back. I wonder if he still has a question. Lance, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. My question was simply on the institutional controls. How do those take into account the other vulnerable populations, or are these just general controls for everybody?
When you say other vulnerable populations, so we're working specifically right now with the Vietnamese, Spanish, and Cambodian communities. The idea is to broaden that out. We work with DRCC, also has a very large reach in the community. So as I noted with the Fisher study, they found that there were 25 or more ethnic and language groups. So this isn't designed to stop at what we're doing now. And then English is the fourth language. So again, I'm pretty new at this. I'm hoping that the fundamental basis of this is that it's accessible to everyone. And that as we have hit our stride developing these tools, now that we have, for example, recipe cards or coloring and activity books, some videos, we know how to do that. The big lift is always getting things out for production the first time. Then, are there other languages? Are there other communities where there's leadership, need that's been identified as the next, to use that onion metaphor in this context, kind of the next layer of the onion. I noted through the Fisher study, it was identified that 25% of the Fishers are Asian Pacific Islanders. So therefore, it wasn't a surprise to me to see that the Cambodian and the Vietnamese communities were identified. DRCC has a long history in this area of working with the Vietnamese and the Spanish communities. So again, those two communities rise to the fore because they have demonstrated leadership. They've done a lot of the community building work, working between the agency, working in amongst themselves, as James talked about, a lot of environmental justice issues there. And so this is one of many things that they have systems and infrastructure that were already in place to then roll out the specific fishing. So I think I'm getting to your question, but if there's something I'm missing, could you ask that part of it?
Let me follow up really quickly. That DRCC was very involved with creating the first pilot programs that EPA accepted as the way things should be done. And I also, one of the things that we look forward to is that we have East African communities and quite honestly, even something like Russian communities that are also fishing on the river. And so how do we expand the program to be able to deal with other communities so that we can make sure that we're dealing with as many people as we possibly can. But again, I'm going to make sure people understand it's so important to be involved very early in the process to be able to influence a process like this. Because if we didn't do those pilot programs, it might be something completely different. And that EPA looked at that and said, this is a very good program. This is something that will work. Helped us to be able to keep moving forward. And that's the point.
If I could add just a little bit to that, so I spent a lot of time thinking, studying, writing about environmental justice, and there's so many dimensions of diversity here, and I really appreciate the question. We've talked a lot about cultural diversity, about different language groups, but there's diversity in terms of, you know, gender, there's diversity in terms of age. You know, we've already heard about outreach to youth through things like a coloring book. If you look at the community involvement plan for the Lower Duwamish, and I appreciate that Julie Condon and Kay Morrison are on here, they've done some really terrific work. You could find ways of reaching out to elder communities, karaoke night, or to reaching out to young families through soccer practice evenings. You know, there's a lot of great ideas that have been circulated, that have been captured from direct community input. The challenge becomes implementation, actually doing things. There's so many great ideas here in this watershed. And the options are there. It's just a question of actually following through and doing a lot of good work. But there's a lot of great ideas, and if you could find the community involvement plan online, it might give you some ideas on what other people have been thinking about, what community members themselves have suggested.
Okay, thank you all. Yeah, that covers what I was asking.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Does not look like anybody else has their hand raised at the moment, and we did promise James that we would take up his second question, which I believe was to Piper before we finished today, which was why were tribes, and I think, James, your question included other Duwamish and urban native groups not involved in development of the IC plan. Did I get that right?
That's unfair to Piper.
I was gonna say, I could have done my homework if you had tipped me off on Friday or given me a quick email. So I just truly don't know.
But it's a question that I think it's important to ask, because I think it's a voice that's important to hear. That's truly an unfair question, because I know you've been doing a lot of work just to kind of get up to speed with what's going on. But as we move forward, that is a question that I think that is going to be important. And here's an example. Muckleshoot has most of the fishing rights on the river. Duwamish also has fishing rights on the river. That is not just salmon. That is shellfish, crab, everything else, which they know that they cannot harvest. And I also understand that there is a specific relationship between EPA and tribes, recognized tribes, that is different. And in some ways, it is a deterrent, because the funding that the tribes have to be able to deal with this on a person-to-person level with EPA lacks what EPA has in what they're moving on. So they are at a disadvantage, but they have a strong place at the table. I understand those things. I can't imagine that tribes would not want to be able to harvest shellfish, crab, and other resources that should be traditional to them from the river that sustained people for millennia. So it's a question and something I look forward to working with you on, maybe as we move forward.
Well, I do know, and I'm sorry if you hear any music. I thought I was going to have a snoring dog. I didn't realize my 20-year-old son would be taking a shower with a volume 10 on his whatever he listens to. Sorry, you can hear that. So I do know that in the Lower Duwamish Waterway Cleanup, there are identified clam habitat And I do know that the cleanup in those areas for harvesting, where there's a 0 to 10 benthic level, so critter level of safe sediment, you look deeper for the clams because they do go deeper. You also look deeper for kids that can dig deeper than 10 centimeters, which is 4 inches for us. So I do know that there are those considerations already in the Lower Duwamish Waterway Cleanup Plan. And there is government-to-government consultation on a variety of issues that's offered really anytime, but we specifically reach out when we're changing phases of the project. So we're in the remedial design for one of the 3 segments of the river right now. So I don't know, from a cleanup side, I don't know what those conversations are, and I truly have not looked into the background of how the tribes have influenced the institutional controls, or clearly there isn't a tool right now that's specifically for tribal members, and all of the tools that are produced are available for everybody. But I don't think that's really getting to the heart of your question, James. So I'll look forward to educating myself more and continuing these conversations with you and the other tribes. The Yakima Nation also has rights in this area. I don't know if they're fishing rights, but I do know that we do have conversation. I've reached out to that tribe as well.
Okay.
Again, I want to make sure that you understand, I know that that's not fair question to you, but it is something.
Oh, James, that's never stopped you before.
No,
it's okay.
No, it hasn't. But as we move forward, how do we talk about this? How do we make sure? Because the communities that I represent here in the Valley respect that opinion from the tribes very much. And so, to have them part of this process in some way, however they want to look at it, and I would, well, whatever help I can be, I would try. So thank you.
All right, and I want to say thank you to everybody. We're just past 1:30 here. It's a really rich discussion. And for everybody who is still with us and everybody who's not, we will be sending out all of the links and the recording to this and the IC 101 again that preceded it, for folks that didn't get a chance to see that one. And I just want to thank everybody who registered and attended and asked questions and joined us today. So on behalf of Northwest Toxic Communities Coalition and the University of Washington Superfund Research Group, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.